Okay, so I'm going to talk today about HDInsight Security. When I do training classes on HDInsight or big data in general, I get a lot of questions about how to integrate it into a production environment. And so I thought I would go ahead and address a lot of the concerns I hear during, certification classes and that type of thing. As Jay mentioned, I'm a cloud solution architect here at Opsgility. Before I came to Opsgility, I worked for Microsoft for about 15 years in various roles. While I was there, I worked with really large customers, mostly in the retail space, Target, Walmart, Best Buy, those types of companies. After Microsoft, I went to work for GameStop for a couple of years and did big data for GameStop for a while, and now I work here at Opsgility. So what we're going to kind of cover in this security overview, I know it's the tag is domain join HDInsight. We will talk about domain join HDInsight because it's one of the critical features of HDInsight Security, but we're going to go ahead and cover all the other security features that are part of HDInsight as well, so that when you are building out HDInsight for your production environments, you kind of know where to focus and what kind of things to look out for. So we'll go ahead and go through all of those here. It'll probably take us about 20 to 30 minutes to get through most of this. It's not a very in-depth, we don't have 2-hour-long demos and those kinds of things. So it should be fairly quick. All right. So HDInsight and enterprise security. So the areas of focus for this on HDInsight, I know everybody's heard the security should be like an onion, not a wall type of comment, and the HDInsight definitely is more like the onion. It has multiple layers of security, and they are broken up typically into data security at the innermost level. Then you have, working your way outward, you have authorization, who has access to what objects and files in HDInsight, and then moves on to authentication, which is kind of one of the key features, and then perimeter level security, which is the more typical infrastructure type security. So most of you advanced users probably understand the perimeter level security fairly well. If you are an HDInsight person, you'll probably understand the authorization components fairly well. I'm going to mainly focus on perimeter and authentication in today's talk, so that I'll do a couple of demos on how to set some of that up and where you find that kind of configuration, and give you a couple of tips along the way. Perimeter security is basically the first layer of defense. So this is things like virtual networks, network security groups, gateways, all the infrastructure you use to enable access to your applications. These are not specific to HDInsight. We are talking about them in reference to HDInsight. HDInsight doesn't actually need you to deploy it to a virtual network. That is an option for HDInsight. For most production workloads that I have worked with, they would have required virtual networks configuration if we were doing them in Azure. So I would assume that that's the case for most environments. They're mostly going to end up deploying to virtual networks, and you'll use network security groups and gateways to lock those down. So sort of the reason why you want to do this is because if you don't, you're basically looking at public endpoints for your HDInsight cluster as the mechanism of access. And so that basically gives any attacker that can figure out the public endpoint one less hoop to jump through. So they can go right to your cluster and start trying to bang away, trying to log in and break passwords and that type of thing. So the way to do that, we set up HDInsight inside of a virtual network, and then we will define network security groups within that virtual network that define or whitelist what networks and IP addresses will accept incoming traffic from. So in this example, I have two virtual networks. They are obviously they would have to be two virtual networks in Azure would have to be joined, peered together. So if they were in Azure, this could be an authorized network in your on-prem environment, in which case you would be VPN'd into your Azure virtual network. But you would set up network security groups to define exactly which networks and IP address ranges would be authorized there. It is typically a best practice to do that so that your only the applications that need direct access to your HDInsight cluster will access it. If it's an HDInsight cluster that's used for things like data science and development, experimentation, that type of work, then you'll want to lock it down to a certain range of IP addresses, whether that be on-prem or whether it's from another machine in Azure, something on the order of a jump box or something like that. So this is the first step and the first best practice around security that most people will come in contact with when dealing with HDInsight. If you've taken a class from Opsgility on the 475 certification class, for example, when we deploy our HDInsight clusters for the labs, we didn't do it into an Azure virtual network and set up all of the extra perimeter security for the sake of simplicity. We were more focused on, moving data around and manipulating data with HDInsight as opposed to things like perimeter security. So a lot of data folks like myself tend to gloss over things like the infrastructure security and that type of thing. But it is something to consider when you're getting ready to productionize it. And also keep in mind that it's a good idea, even if you're not at the production step, if you're building it out for testing and proof of concept, it's a good idea to start experimenting with virtual networks and network security groups to lock it down. You don't want to find out the day that you're scheduled to move to production that the network security group configuration that you have decided upon doesn't work. So it's a good idea to keep it to keep that ongoing throughout the process so that you have a solid plan when you move to production. The next feature around perimeter security is service tunneling. And so the number one question I get from the number one specific question I get from students in the big data class is about the public endpoints for Azure Blob Storage and Azure Data Lake Store and how HDInsight interfaces with that. So basically the problem here is that Blob Storage and Data Lake Store have public endpoints by default. When you create them, they have public endpoints. You can't turn them off. They just have them. If you connect HDInsight to it in the default configuration, it's going to use the public endpoint to gain access to Blob Storage or Data Lake Store. So all your communication, even though it is encrypted traffic, is still going over the public internet to access your storage, which is not ideal. So service tunneling basically allows you to access storage accounts through the virtual network that will use the Azure backbone and not go across the public internet. It's very easy to configure this. When you set up a virtual network, I'll go ahead and pull one up real quick. I'm going to pull up a resource group here. Looking into one of my resource groups, this is a resource group that hosts some Active Directory domain controllers that I have set up out here. And I have a virtual network right here called HDI VNet. You can open this up and you can see there are service endpoints. And you can add them. You can also turn this on at create time when you create the, when you go ahead and create your virtual network, but usually you end up turning it on after the fact. You have different types of options here. You have SQL and storage. So we're going to pick storage. It's going to ask for a subnet. I just have one subnet. So, and then you just say click add. And then it says it'll take 15 minutes to complete. Now, anything that I have deployed in this virtual network on that subnet is now going to use the Azure backbone to connect to the storage account on the back end instead of going across the public internet. So your internet traffic, while it's still secured, it's still encrypted connections, it's not subject to the ebbs and flows of the internet. So another good best practice there. If anybody has any questions while I'm doing the presentation, please, you can use the question entry in the GoToWebinar or the chat, either one I can answer. And James is monitoring those as well, so he can keep me honest on that.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's go back to the presentation. Okay, so those are the two main things that I like to point out around perimeter security for HDInsight. These public endpoints is a real sticking point for a lot of companies. So it's definitely something you'll want to consider. I don't have any information on performance, whether the performance is significantly better. In theory, it should be better that you're going across the Azure backbone and not across the public internet, but I have not seen any data around that. So if you were going to ask that question, I don't have the answer to that yet. All right, we're going to jump to the inner, from the outer all the way to the outer to the inner ring of HDInsight Security here. And this is around data security. And basically this is just, how you manage data out other than through HDInsight. So this is data encryption by default in all the storage types you can use for HDInsight. They are now all encrypted by default. That used to not be the case. It used to be that storage and data lake store were not encrypted by default. It was just an option. They are now all encrypted by default. So if you go create a new data lake store, you'll see that it is enabled by default. Yeah, let's see. If I go data lake store, and just hit create, and data lake store is incredibly easy to create. You can see it's enabled by default now, so you shouldn't have anything to worry about. You should leave this as encrypted. I've not been to any I've never worked for a company that said, nah, we don't need encryption. Everybody wants encryption for everything, especially now that we've had over the last few years, we've had so many leaks of information and information stolen and that type of thing. So data lake store is encrypted by default. Storage accounts are also encrypted by default. So if I drill in to my AD account here, let's see if this is this might be premium storage, so this may be a little different. Yeah, and you can see here, this is a premium storage account. This is not, but standard storage accounts are the same. They're all encrypted by default. So if you don't want encryption, you'll have to turn it off on your own. But if anything you create nowadays will have encryption turned on by default. This encryption doesn't require you to manage anything. Microsoft manages key rotation and everything on the back end for you automatically. So the integration with HDInsight is more or less seamless. So you should have almost no overhead from using encryption, at least from a management standpoint. All right. Okay, so authentication. This is basically talking about Active Directory. So when I talk about authentication, there are two types of authentication that you can use for HDInsight. There are local users that you can create in HDInsight, and you can do that through Apache Ranger, which is a premium HDInsight cluster option, and I'll walk through creating a cluster so I can point out all these options for you here in a bit. But the other option is to have domain join and use Active Directory for authentication. There are a few different architectures for this out there. What I have shown here is probably what is going to be the dominant architecture for the near future. Unless you have a cloud-born network that's never been on-prem, you're more than likely going to have Active Directory on-prem, so you'll have existing AD. Your domain admins will set up Azure Active Directory domain services, and you will install HDInsight and configure it to connect to Active Directory. You can also stand up Active Directory domain controllers in Azure and have them reside in the same VNet. If you have on-prem systems, that's not necessarily a bad way to go. It's a lot easier or simpler to configure. You don't have to learn how to deal with Active Directory domain services and that type of thing. But most corporations have on-prem, and they will probably use Active Directory with domain services for domain services in Azure. When you do that, the domain services will sync with your on-prem AD, and then when a user logs in to HDInsight, it'll pull Kerberos tickets from Azure Active Directory. And users will be able to log in with their normal domain credentials, just like they do any other application. There's no difference. The only slight negative there is that you have to, new users will have to be, if you are managing users within HDInsight at an individual level, every time you have to add one, you're going to have to go into each HDInsight cluster and add them. That's not a requirement per se. The best practice, just like with anything else with domain credentials, is to create a group and just grant access to the group to what they need. It's the exact same pattern that you would have in on-prem environments or any other authentication system. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of these configuration options that we've gone through. I'm just going to go ahead and create a new HDInsight cluster. And just a pro tip here, you'll notice that I search for everything. I don't use the menus to navigate over here. The reason why is, if you don't know, the Azure portal updates every Thursday around noon Pacific time. And when that happens, all this GUI interface that you see is subject to change. So more times than I can count, I've been burned in labs for classes and things like that, where students have gone, I've had instructions to click new, click data and analytics, click HDInsight, and then they rename something and then people can't find it. So it's always the best practice just to search for things. It'll always come up that way. So I'm going to choose an HDInsight cluster. And by default, HDInsight's going to jump into the quick create. This is fine if you want the default sizing. I think it's 4 nodes. It uses about 40 cores if you do the default, I think. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit custom just so we can take a look at all the setting options that we have. I will call this cluster. We're going to call it CONT for Contoso 9607. And then I'm going to click cluster type. From our security standpoint, this is where clustering can get interesting. Only a few supported cluster types are available for the more advanced security. Hadoop is one, Spark, and interactive query, which, if you're not familiar with interactive query, I can forgive you for that. It's in the normal Hadoop ecosystem, it's usually referred to as LLAP, for long-lived in process. It doesn't really mean a whole lot. It's just something I think they thought sounded cool and Star Trek-y, so that's why they do that. But those are the cluster types that are supported for the more advanced security features. So I'm going to pick the default Hadoop cluster, and I'm going to leave the default version. And I'm going to go ahead and click this enterprise security package checkbox. And you'll notice when I did that, that the features list changed, and it added a couple of things to the bottom here. One is Apache Ranger, and it'll give you a little description of what that is. And then domain join, which is also something we want in our cluster. So you also have options, data lake store access, use data lake as primary store. These will change over time, so keep an eye on it. Don't just assume that it's always going to be the same. So we'll just go ahead and hit select there. It's asking for some login information. I will create a new. And I will call this, we're going to go, I'm in Dallas, so I'm going to pick South Central region because it's closer, and my domain controllers and my virtual network are in Dallas. So I picked South Central. So clicking next. What it's doing right now is it's trying to validate my domain, the domain name that I chose. So got through that. It's going to need a storage account. I'm just going to take the default Azure storage since I don't have a data lake store set up. New storage account. Okay. Metastore settings. You don't need to fill in any of these. If you're going to be deleting and rebuilding your cluster, or you want to support easier upgrades in the future, I suggest that you at least consider creating a SQL database to store Hive metadata, Oozie metadata, and Ranger metadata. I believe Oozie is irrelevant once you do domain join clusters. I don't think you can do Oozie any longer. But for these others, I would at least consider it if you think you might ever need to tear this cluster down. If you're not familiar with how the overall Hadoop architecture for Azure PaaS services for HDInsight, ask me at the end and I can kind of go over that real quick if we have time. So I'll click next. The next page is the applications page. These are all add-ons that you can choose to install at create time. I'm not going to choose any of these. A lot of these have extra licensing requirements and things. I don't have any licensing for any of this. And so I'm just going to click next to go past this. Cluster size. It's going to default, the default size is 4 worker nodes. You don't have to do that. You can do whatever makes sense. What you need to keep in mind is right down here, this little box here, if you click on it, it'll show you how many cores are used in that region and how many you have available and how many you have available in all the other regions. So you can see that in this particular region, I've already used 16 cores. I have 44 available according to this little pop-up chart. So if you need to increase this, you have to open a ticket with Azure support. They're usually pretty responsive. You just need to tell them how many total cores you want and what region. They're usually pretty amenable to increasing core count, core quota, as long as it's not an Azure PaaS or some type of trial account or something like that. If it's a regular corporate account, they're usually pretty open to increasing it unless you ask for something really big, in which case they're going to want to have a discussion with you to make sure you're not just throwing money down the tubes. So I'm going to lower this down to just 1 node because I don't really, I'm not really going to do any actual work with this. And you can see it makes it quite a bit cheaper. And if you're not aware, they just cut the pricing to HDInsight, I believe, a few days ago. So it should be about 50% of what it was last year now. So you should have should be a little easier bill to swallow at the end of the month there. So we'll click next. And then we get to advanced settings. And this is where the domain join components come in. So I'm going to take the last setting first, and this is virtual network settings. So you're going to want a virtual network deployment if you're going to use domain settings. I'm going to pick HDI VNet, which is in the AD resource group. That's what that /AD is telling me. That's to help you identify if you have multiple virtual networks and that have the same name, you can identify them by resource group if you need to. If you had multiple subnets, you can choose that here. I only have one called the AD subnet, and you can choose that setting right here. If I click on domain settings, you'll see it comes up with a bunch of information it's going to ask for my domain. I'm going to go ahead and fill this in. I'm going to go contoso.com. I think it's demo user is my admin account. And it's flagging my demo user account. And the reason why is because it needs the domain qualifier. It's asking for a password. Okay, and then organizational unit. So organizational unit, it gives you a nice example there. If you start typing, it's going to go away. So you're going to want to probably figure that out ahead of time. And if this OU does not exist, it will try and create it using this domain account. So it doesn't have to exist. It'll try and figure it out for you. And then it's going to ask for the LDAP address, which has to be configured ahead of time. And it's asking me if I want to add any users. And I am going to add a user. I'm going to add a resource group or a user group that I created called HDInsight users. It just has a couple of users in it so that they can, connect and do their work as they see fit. And by using a group, I don't need to use, I don't have to go in and add each individual user. I can just let the powers that be, HR or management or whoever, add people to the right groups, and then everything on my cluster should be up to date. So we'll hit select, and then we will click next. And it'll take a minute to do a validation of my cluster config. And there is some peculiarities with HDInsight. I've seen a lot of times where particular configurations of HDInsight aren't supported in a certain region, for example, and it will still pass validation. And so you'll create it and the cluster will start creating and then it will fail. That happens a lot on HDInsight clusters. If you've ever seen the number of resources it creates, it's quite a bit. What you see in the portal is just a single HDInsight PaaS service. And then the back end, Microsoft is managing all those resources. And that's the part you don't see is all those resources. For every node you create, it's the equivalent of a virtual machine. So Microsoft, there's a ton of resources, and it makes this validation step pretty complicated. So if that happens, you're basically just going to have to try and use another region. Usually the regions to use are going to be either East US, East US 2, West US, or West US 2. Those are usually the ones that support the newer preview features and that type of thing. In this case, the domain join has been out for a while, so this is supported everywhere. So, all right, and I'll hit create. This takes about half an hour to create, half an hour or so to create. So we're not going to sit here and wait on it or anything, but that's essentially all it takes to add it. Compared to creating a regular HDInsight cluster, there's not a whole lot of extra steps. The main extra step is that you have to have an active domain controller to connect to. And I had pre-created that using a template from the marketplace. and it just automatically creates a domain, and you give it a domain name, and it creates this entire resource group for you, including the virtual network and 2 domain controllers. So this is what I connected to. All right. All right, so that's pretty much it for domain join clusters. So one last thing I wanted to talk about is HDInsight authorization. This is where Apache Ranger comes in on HDInsight. It also encompasses file and folder ACLs, how you're going to access databases and tables. You can set up Hive or HBase policies within Apache Ranger, so you can lock down access at a per table level or what have you, so that you can control at a more granular level. You can control people's access just like you do in things like SQL database and that type of thing. So, all right, so that's all I have for today. Went a little bit right at about 30 minutes, I think. So I think I